I don't think I can recall an example in our lifetime of mission creep and escalation as vivid as the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine, because the war has been driven by one dynamic. Every month, President Biden and the Obama and the Biden White House promise that there is some line that they will not cross. The Ukrainians start demanding it. Neocons and warmongers in Washington echo those demands. The Biden administration says this is something we will not do because doing that will be too escalatory, too dangerous, will drag us and our country too much in that war. Sometimes weeks later, sometimes months later, the U.S. turns around and provides exactly the weapons that it once said it would and could never provide. That happened with long-range missiles. It happened with tanks. It happened with F-16 fighter jets. And now it's happening again with cluster bombs, a weapon that, for very good reason, is banned by over 100 countries, not because it's some powerful, scary weapon too potent to use in war, but because it's a weapon uniquely suited to kill civilians in the area in which it's used, and not just civilians, but principally children, and not only during the conflict, but for years to come after the conflict, because so often these munitions do not explode. They're duds. They fall somewhere. Some children find them while playing, and the bomb detonates, and it kills many civilians. This has happened over and over and over again, which is why around the world, these munitions are considered immoral. In fact, last year when Russia was reportedly using them in Ukraine, Jen Psaki, on behalf of the White House, said that Russia was committing war crimes simply by using these bombs that we are now providing to Ukraine. And the reason we're providing them to Ukraine is because both Ukraine and now the United States face a munition shortage and artillery shortage. Ukraine has a shortage of munitions because the United States has a shortage of munitions. We've depleted our own military supplies to fuel this proxy war in Ukraine, and we don't have any more artillery to give to Ukraine. And so we're giving them cluster munitions instead, not only risking the lives of all kinds of Ukrainian civilians. Remember, the people we're supposed to be going to war in order to protect, whose lives are now going to be endangered. Often the people in Ukraine who are not loyal to the government in Kiev, but who live in eastern Ukraine, the ethnic Russians who have been fighting the central government in Kiev for the last 8 years to have a separatist or semi-autonomous region. Those are the people most in danger. And the U.S. is yet again risking its own soft power, its own standing in the world by providing weapons to Ukraine that most of the world considers intrinsically immoral. First of all, here's the report from the Washington Post on July 6th. Quote, Biden approves cluster munition supply to Ukraine. The article reads, the subheadline is, transfer will bypass legal limits on dud rate for the controversial weapons. Quote, President Biden has approved the provision of U.S. cluster munitions for Ukraine, with drawdown of the weapons from Defense Department stocks due to be announced Friday. The move, which will bypass U.S. law prohibiting the production, use, or transfer of cluster munitions with a failure rate of more than 1%, comes amid concerns about Kiev's lagging counteroffensive against entrenched Russian troops and dwindling Western stocks of conventional artillery. Now, you probably remember this vaunted counteroffensive that people like David Petraeus and Max Boot in the Washington Post were promising you was coming and would change the course of the war, and for that reason, you should just hold on for a little bit longer. Ukrainian victory was on the way. The Washington Post just a couple of weeks ago had a top secret scoop that its national security reporter Shane Harris proudly touted that, for one thing, was based entirely on leaks of top secret information. Remember, Washington is supposed to pretend to be so concerned about the leak of classified information that President Trump is now indicted on federal charges, not for leaking classified information, but simply for storing it improperly or in a negligent way. And yet every day you can pick up the Washington Post or the New York Times, and there's leaks of top secret information. Nobody cares. Nobody wants to find the person who did it because they weaponize leaks all the time for propaganda. And the article was essentially nothing other than this proud scoop that CIA officials went to Kiev and got convinced that glorious victory is coming with the counteroffensive. In reality, as we've showed you, and as they're now acknowledging, the counteroffensive is a joke. It has almost accomplished nothing. The Russian forces are deeply entrenched in their defensive positions all through the front line in eastern and southern Ukraine. It's very difficult for Ukraine to penetrate those front lines. If they're able to do so, it will be not months, but years. So this war will just continue to go on, and your money will be transferred out of the U.S. Treasury into the coffers of Ukraine, long regarded as the most corrupt nation in Europe. As the New York Times editorializes, as it did last week, as we showed you, that the U.S. is drowning in debt, and therefore Americans need to prepare for what the paper calls costly or painful cuts to Social Security and Medicaid, but we certainly have enough, as usual, to fund on this war in Ukraine. That's why these cluster munitions are being provided, because the United States doesn't have the artillery supply necessary to furnish to Ukraine. So we're depleting our own weaponry, our own self-defense, our own military over who rules eastern Ukraine. The Washington Post goes on, quote, "The decision follows months of internal administration debate over whether to supply the controversial munitions, which are banned by most countries in the world." What are cluster munitions, the widely banned weapon Biden is sending to Ukraine? Cluster weapons explode in the air over a target, releasing dozens to hundreds of smaller submunitions across a wide area. More than 120 countries have joined a convention banning their use as inhumane and indiscriminate, in large part because of high failure rates that litter the landscape with unexploded submunitions that endanger both friendly troops and civilians, often for decades after the conflict ends. The United States, Ukraine, and Russia, which is alleged to have used them extensively in Ukraine, are not parties to the convention. 8 of NATO's 31 members, including the United States, have not ratified the convention, which means that 23 NATO members out of 31 have ratified it, have banned these weapons, including every country in Western Europe. It's the countries in Eastern Europe that have not. So this is an incredibly controversial decision around the world. You may not care about that, but what that means is that U.S. standing has eroded even further. The Chinese will be able to use this decision to rile up anti-American sentiment the way they are very adept at doing these days, increasing Chinese influence all over the world. While this decision is extremely controversial throughout the world, in Washington, as you would expect, it's being applauded by the most deranged warmongers. Here, for example, is Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who quite literally has never encountered a proposed American war or an actual American war that he did not cheer. You show him an American war, an actual one or a proposed one, and he will immediately start beating the war drums. Here he is heaping praise on Joe Biden for this decision. Quote, in a July 7th tweet, "I support and appreciate the Biden administration sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. We must provide the Ukrainians the tools they need to evict the Russian invaders." Why not give them nuclear weapons if that's the principle? What is the limiting principle here? The idea that the Ukrainians are now going to breach the front lines of Russia with cluster munitions seems extremely improbable. But if the idea is, and I've heard people say this, look, it's war, we just give whatever weapons we can use, why not just bomb Russian apartment buildings? Why not just deliberately target Russian civilians? Why not give Ukraine nuclear weapons? Of course there are limits to what we ought to do in order to help Ukraine win this war. Cluster munitions are despised around the world. They've often killed American troops as well, who find them and then they detonate. Not only Lindsey Graham, but also John Bolton heaped praise on Joe Biden here from the Hill on July 7th. Quote, John Bolton hails Biden's decision to send cluster bombs to Ukraine. You see there in the headline, he called it, quote, an excellent idea. So you have Lindsey Graham, John Bolton cheering Biden. Also, Alexander Vindman, the American-Ukrainian fanatic who was at the center of the first impeachment trial of Donald Trump, who became a resistance and MSNBC hero as a result. There in the Hill, quote, Vindman on cluster munitions, quote, from a practical standpoint, the president did the right thing. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman said on Saturday that President Biden, quote, did the right thing in agreeing to send cluster munitions to Ukraine. Quote, from a practical standpoint, the president did the right thing, he told CNN, adding, Ukraine is going to be very mindful. In a lot of ways, it seems counterintuitive, but it's frankly one of the most humane things that they could do, he continued. Instead of having this war run indefinitely, having a sharp, punctuated conclusion to the war is a pretty humane approach. These are the people who've been saying for a year and a half, just about, that Russia is on the verge of collapse, that Ukraine is about to win, that providing these long-range missiles, providing these tanks, providing these F-16s are going to ensure Ukraine wins the war quickly. None of that, of course, happens. They're never discredited. They come right back. They make the similar promises, and nobody reminds them that every time they promised them before, it is proven untrue. Now, let's look at what happens, and this, to me, is such a perfect illustration of how U.S. foreign policy functions and the mentality behind U.S. endless war, which is that we impose rules on the rest of the world that we very flagrantly exempt ourselves from whenever we want. Here is Jen Psaki in February of 2023, so just a few months ago, speaking about reports that Russia used cluster munitions in Ukraine.
Of illegal cluster bombs and vacuum bombs being used by the Russians. If that's true, what is the next step of this administration, and is there a red line for how much violence will be tolerated against civilians in this manner that's illegal and potentially a war crime?
Okay, so first of all, listen to that question. That's what these journalists do all the time. They always question the White House, not from the perspective of, are you involving Americans in a war in which we have no vital interest? Or isn't this becoming dangerous, what we're doing? Instead, the perspective always is, why aren't we more involved in this war? The reporter called the use of cluster bombs a war crime. She said that that cluster munitions themselves are illegal, and basically pressed the White House on whether we would become directly involved in the war, whether we would go to war with Russia if they continue to use cluster munitions. That's what she meant by a red line. That was always the phrase they meant when they tried to pressure the Obama administration to go to war with Syria directly instead of just having the CIA do a clandestine war, a dirty war against the Assad regime. She was doing exactly what the media did constantly throughout the Obama years, saying, what's the red line? And then President Obama finally said the red line is the use of chemical weapons. There were claims that Assad used chemical weapons, and the media began openly and flagrantly demanding that the U.S. intervene directly in that war, put boots on the ground combat troops in Syria, and remove Assad from power. Why would the U.S. do that? Why is it in the interest of the American people who rule Syria? So this is what she's doing. She's demanding that Jen Psaki say, what is the red line for U.S. involvement in the war beyond just fueling a proxy war, but directly fighting with combat troops? And the premise of the question is, the use of cluster bombs is a war crime, and cluster bombs themselves are, quote, illegal. The same weapons we're now giving to Ukraine, and this is what Jen Psaki said.
It would be. I don't have any confirmation of that. We have seen the reports. If that were true, it would potentially be a war crime. Obviously, there are a range of international fora that would assess that. So certainly we would look to that to be a part of that conversation.
So it would likely be a war crime simply to use cluster munitions. No indication of how they're being used, whether they're being used recklessly. And remember, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, on cluster bombs, that 120 countries have signed, does not demand they be used responsibly. They just ban them on the grounds that they're intrinsically irresponsible because they will inevitably result in the loss of a large amount of civilian life. And since we're in the war in Ukraine, ostensibly to protect civilian life, it's kind of a strange thing to do to send them weapons that we know will kill civilians in the war zone, meaning Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian children, who will find these undetonated weapons. And when they do, they will be killed, as has happened so often. Here, for example, is a USA Today article from April 4th, a few months ago, from a soldier who writes, quote, I dropped cluster bombs on Laos in the U.S. secret war there. Ukraine shouldn't want this nightmare. The subheadline says, all that was accomplished by using these inhumane weapons was to leave a trail of destruction that remains to this day, and a deep sense of regret for U.S. veterans like myself. This is what the author wrote, quote, Ukrainian leaders in Kiev and members of the Republican Party who have asked the Biden administration to release cluster munitions for use in Ukraine should be aware of what they asked for. The results will be deadly and disastrous and will haunt the United States and the people of Ukraine for decades. I participated in the extensive bombing of Laos during America's secret war. From December 1966 until December 1968, I was assigned to air bases in Thailand. The primary mission of the units to which I was assigned was to stop the flow of personnel and materials coming from North Vietnam through the Ho Chi Minh Trail to South Vietnam. Despite the 2.5 million tons of ordnance that the United States dropped from 1964 to 1973, it did nothing to impede the traffic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All that was accomplished by using these inhumane weapons was to leave a trail of destruction that remains to this day, and a deep set of regret for U.S. veterans like myself. Up to 30% of these, quote, airborne mines did not explode on impact, but remained buried in the ground for future generations to trip over. Since 1964, more than 50,000 men, women, and children have been killed or maimed in Laos. A third of Laos's beautiful land is held hostage by unexploded or exploded ordnance, preventing farmers from working the land to feed their families. Talking about 60 years later, and large parts of Laos are unusable because of cluster bombs. That's why they're banned by 120 countries, not because there's some potent weapon that tough guys use to win war, and if you want to win war, you dig deep and you use whatever you have. They're not weapons that are uniquely effective. They're just weapons that kill civilians at an enormous rate, not only during the conflict, but for decades to come. This country is going to be littered with these weapons. And they may have lower dud rates, but they still have dud rates above 1%, well above 1%. Here from the outstanding independent media outlet Declassified UK on July 6th, so a few days ago, is a anecdote about their use in Kosovo. Cluster bombs for Ukraine, a warning from Kosovo. And this article reads, quote, with Washington poised to ship cluster bombs to Kiev, Declassified visits Kosovo to review the grim legacy of NATO firing this banned weapon in the Balkans. Thousands of bomblets failed to detonate on impact, posing a hazard to children who mistook their little yellow parachutes for toys in the decade after the war. These remnants claimed another 178 casualties in Kosovo. Unexploded cluster munitions remain a hazard in Kosovo long after NATO's 11-week air war ended in 1999. Goran, a Kosovo Serb, recalls how the weapon almost killed a farmer in a vineyard near Garancia's Orthodox monastery, a World Heritage Site. His dates tally with a British demining charity, the Halo Trust, which said it was, quote, still finding hundreds of cluster bombs in Kosovo that same year. At one site near Junik in western Kosovo, they cleared 171 cluster bombs dropped by NATO, which stubbornly refuses to provide aid workers with access to its official database of airstrikes. Partly as a result of these difficulties, 44 hazardous sites were yet to be fully demined by the end of 2021. While the Atlantic Alliance justifies its wartime conduct by saying the targets were Serb soldiers, the people now living in the liberated areas are often ethnic Albanians, the very people NATO set out to save. Remember, these weapons are going to be used in eastern and southern Ukraine where the Russian forces are dug in, not in Russia. The people who are going to find these bombs and be killed by them for years to come are Ukrainian civilians. And they're not Ukrainian civilians who live in western Ukraine, who are often loyal to the Ukrainian government. They're people who have been opposed to, even enemies of the Kiev government, which might be one of the reasons why Zelensky doesn't care. The question is, should the U.S. have this moral mar on its record, and for what? Here from the New York Times in 2019, quote, America's dark history of killing its own troops with cluster munitions. Quote, the weapons are notorious for their effects on civilians, but 5 years of reporting and hundreds of interviews have revealed they've also killed and wounded scores of Americans. The devastating effect that dud bomblets from cluster munitions have inflicted on civilians is well documented. They have killed or injured an estimated 56,000 to 86,000 civilians since World War II. The United States alone has spent more than $3.4 billion on demining operations since 1993, including in countries where it released hundreds of millions of bomblets in past wars that continue to kill and maim civilians. Relatively few Americans loitered in Iraq and Kuwait after the ceasefire, but their military's cluster bombs kept stalking them. Between the start of the invasion in late February and early April, some 24 soldiers and Marines were killed by American submunition duds of all kinds. An additional 18 were killed by explosions that most likely came from submunitions. The records are unclear. The U.S. and the British used them in Iraq back in 2003, and it was widely denounced. Here from The Guardian, April 4th, 2003, just a week or so after the invasion of Iraq began, the British use of cluster bombs has been condemned, and it details how American and British forces were accused of breaking international laws after admitting that they used cluster bombs. So this history is a long and ugly history that has damaged American standing in the world and killed a huge number of civilians. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.